The hall was empty, until 3 women from my workplace quietly surrounded me. The office felt unusually quiet that afternoon. The usual hum of keyboards and low chatter had dwindled to a faint murmur, and even the overhead lights seemed to cast a softer glow than normal. Walking down the hall, each step echoed more than it should have, a hollow sound that made the space feel both larger and strangely intimate. There was a peculiar weight in the air, a sense that something was off, or perhaps, that someone was waiting. At first, it was just a feeling, a subtle tug at the edges of attention. Then, out of the corner of the eye, movement flickered. A shadow shifted near the far doorway, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the chest tighten and the heart beat a little faster. He paused, pretending to check his phone, though the screen offered no real distraction. The hall remained empty, or so it seemed. Then he noticed them. 3 women, colleagues he had known for months, positioned in different parts of the hall, yet arranged in a way that felt intentional. One leaned casually against the wall near the stairwell, her posture relaxed but eyes sharp, tracking his every move. Another stood halfway down the corridor, a hand brushing lightly over the railing, as if absent-mindedly, though the attention in her gaze betrayed her calm facade. The third lingered near the conference room, her head tilted slightly, the faintest smile playing on her lips, as though she were waiting for something, or someone. Each detail became magnified in the quiet hall. The soft swish of their clothes as they shifted weight, the faint scent of perfume mingling with the lingering aroma of office coffee, the subtle brush of a hand against the doorway, all of it created a tension that hummed beneath the surface. His chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and nervous curiosity. He tried to read their expressions, searching for a clue, but found only calm, measured attention. He realized that his pulse had quickened. There was something unspoken in the way they held themselves, a quiet assertion of presence that drew attention without a word. Every small movement, a glance, a flick of hair, a gentle shift in stance, felt deliberate, magnetic. And yet, there was no rush, no overt demand for interaction. It was as if time itself had slowed, holding the moment in a suspended bubble, making every sensation sharper, every thought heavier. In that silence, the mind began to wander, imagining the possibilities. Were they just noticing him in a rare, fleeting way, or was there something more intentional? The mind and body both responded, a shiver down the spine, the warmth of anticipation in the chest, and the subtle awareness that this moment was not ordinary. The empty hall had become a stage, and he was the focal point, surrounded by attention that was both disarming and quietly electrifying. Even before a word was spoken, he felt the story beginning. The hall wasn't empty, not really. It was full of expectation, curiosity, and the first threads of connection that promised something far beyond a routine afternoon at work. And as he took another cautious step forward, the awareness deepened, something was about to shift, and he had no choice but to notice. The first words came softly, almost casually, yet they carried a weight that made him pause. One of the women, the one leaning near the stairwell, stepped a little closer, closing the distance without breaking the natural flow of the hall. Her voice, warm and measured, seemed to wrap around him like a gentle pull, inviting attention without demanding it. He realized his chest was tight, the faintest flutter of nerves brushing against curiosity. "Busy afternoon?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, eyes locking with his in a way that felt intimate even in the empty hall. There was no urgency in her tone, yet the underlying awareness was undeniable, a silent acknowledgement that this moment was theirs alone. He opened his mouth to respond, but words stumbled, awkward and tentative, betraying the calm he tried to maintain. It wasn't just her voice or proximity that stirred something inside him. It was the subtle details, the tilt of her shoulder, as she leaned slightly forward, the faint brushing of her sleeve as her arm moved to gesture at a document she carried, the warmth of her presence that seemed to radiate into the cool air of the corridor. Every micro-movement became amplified, a silent language that made his mind race with possibilities. As they exchanged small talk about work, projects, deadlines, meetings, he found himself noticing things he had never observed before: the delicate curve of her wrist as she rested it lightly on the railing, the soft cadence of her laughter, the way her gaze lingered on his face just a moment longer than necessary. These were casual gestures in ordinary circumstances, but here, in the quiet hall, they carried an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The other two women, still at a slight distance, added to the weight of the moment without a single word. One leaned against the doorway with a relaxed poise, arms loosely crossed but body angled slightly toward him, her presence a quiet reinforcement of the attention he suddenly felt wrapped around him from every side. The third subtly adjusted her stance, the light shift of her weight drawing him into the web of awareness that seemed to close gently around him, yet never aggressively. He became acutely aware of himself, the slight trembling of his hands, the heat in his cheeks, the quickening of his pulse. Every instinct told him to remain composed, to act normal, but the sensory overload of proximity, warmth, and intent attention made it nearly impossible. It was a delicate balance of tension and curiosity, where a single smile or tilt of the head could feel like a profound confession. A nervous laugh escaped him, soft and unplanned, and she mirrored it, her eyes crinkling in a subtle but telling way. The connection felt immediate and quiet, not declared, but undeniable. He realized he was drawn in, not just by her presence, but by the magnetic interplay of attention, subtle touch, and unspoken understanding. By the time the brief conversation ended, he was left with a lingering awareness, the sensation of warmth where her hand had briefly brushed against his arm, the echo of her laughter in the quiet hall, and the undeniable pull of curiosity. What would happen next? The moment had shifted something inside him, opening the door to a connection that was just beginning to stir, fragile yet undeniable. The hallway felt smaller now, yet paradoxically, larger, the air thick with unspoken intention. He noticed, almost subconsciously, how the three women's movements were no longer incidental. Their positions, previously casual, now carried a subtle choreography, a quiet magnetic pull that drew him into the center of their attention. Each step he took seemed measured against the backdrop of their presence, and each glance exchanged between them hinted at an understanding he wasn't fully invited into, yet. As he continued down the corridor, one of the women, the one near the conference room, leaned slightly closer under the guise of reading a note pinned to the wall. Her shoulder nearly brushed his, the faintest contact sending a warmth that was both surprising and undeniably grounding. He felt the soft brush of her fabric against his arm, an innocuous gesture by all appearances, yet charged with a quiet intimacy. The subtle tilt of her head, the way her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than expected, made his pulse stutter in an unfamiliar rhythm. The woman near the stairwell had shifted as well, closing the gap ever so slightly. She rested a hand lightly on the railing, angled toward him, and for a moment he noticed the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of years lived fully, yet softened by gentleness. There was a strength in her stillness, a confidence that was oddly reassuring and subtly provocative. He felt drawn to it, almost against his own conscious judgment, sensing a depth behind her smile that went beyond mere workplace friendliness. The third woman, positioned closer to the far end, gave him a fleeting glance that caught him entirely off guard. Her eyes held a quiet amusement, a knowing sparkle that seemed to recognize his growing awareness of their collective presence. The way she shifted her weight, just enough to bring her arm into view near his, created a rhythm that was hypnotic, small, almost accidental touches that lingered in his mind long after the contact had passed. Every small interaction became magnified. A finger lightly brushing against his arm as she laughed at something small and mundane, the warmth radiating from her proximity, the subtle sway of her body as she adjusted her stance, all of it created an electric undercurrent. He was painfully aware of his own responses, the tightening in his chest, the heat in his palms, the quickening of his heartbeat. Each subtle gesture felt loaded with meaning, though it was impossible to pinpoint why, or how much of it was simply perception. The air between them seemed charged with a quiet energy, an invisible tension that was not awkward, not intrusive, but profoundly alive. Their attention was gentle, deliberate, and coaxing, creating a space where he felt simultaneously exposed and understood. It was a delicate balance. Every glance, every shift in stance, every subtle touch was a thread weaving a tapestry of curiosity, anticipation, and silent connection. By the time he reached the end of the hall, the awareness of their presence had deepened, leaving him with a strange, thrilling tension. He could feel the warmth of each nearby body lingering in his memory, the subtle brush of fabric and fingertips, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of shared breaths in close proximity. And through it all, a silent question hovered: how far would this quiet closeness go, and what would happen when the walls of the office were no longer a buffer between them? The moment shifted from mere proximity to something deeper, a subtle unfolding of vulnerability that neither of them had anticipated. The hallway, still quiet, felt warmer somehow, as if the air itself was leaning closer, attuned to the emotions threading through the small group. Conversation, once light and casual, began to take on a weightier tone, honest glimpses into their lives slipping between words about deadlines and meetings. One of the women, the one near the stairwell, spoke of a challenge at home, her voice soft and tinged with a quiet fatigue. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a simple sharing of truth, but it landed differently in the hallway than it would have over email or during a crowded meeting. He found himself leaning in slightly, drawn to the steadiness in her tone, the way her hand rested lightly on the railing, fingers loosely curling around the edge. There was trust in her posture, an invitation to engage beyond the superficial, and he realized with an unexpected pang that he wanted to meet it. The second woman, still positioned near the conference room, added a small, personal anecdote, her laughter soft but sincere. He noticed the warmth radiating from her, not just in the words, but in the subtle brush of her shoulder as she shifted closer, almost imperceptibly. It was a gesture that could have been accidental, but the way it lingered in his awareness made it feel deliberate, intimate, almost comforting. His own body responded without thinking, a slight tension in the chest, the quickening of his heartbeat, the curious warmth spreading across his palms. Even the third woman, leaning against the far doorway, contributed with quiet observations about her work and the people she admired. Her gaze met his occasionally, holding a kind of unspoken understanding that made him acutely aware of their shared space. The connection was gentle, but it carried gravity, like a current beneath still water, powerful yet subtle. Every glance felt like a thread linking them, every gesture a signal of care and attention. As the conversation continued, small touches began to occur almost naturally, a hand briefly resting on his forearm while emphasizing a point, the brush of a sleeve against his wrist as they shifted slightly closer, the warmth that lingered just long enough to register, but never to overstep. Each contact was measured, deliberate in its gentleness, a language without words, and he found himself savoring the quiet intimacy it offered. In those moments, he realized that vulnerability wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was about presence, the way they allowed themselves to be seen, fully, even in a professional environment. And he, in turn, felt the walls around his own guarded emotions soften, a tentative trust blooming where uncertainty had once been. The experience was heady, not with desire or lust, but with a quiet recognition of connection, a sense that being close, emotionally and physically, could be profoundly affirming. By the time the brief exchange wound down, the air between them felt charged, alive with possibility. Their smiles lingered a moment longer than necessary, hands brushed with gentle intent, and the warmth of shared attention settled deep in his chest. For the first time that day, he understood the gravity of subtlety, that in small touches, in honest words, in shared glances, a bond could form strong enough to alter the rhythm of a day, leaving an imprint he would not soon forget. The hall had transformed from a place of quiet observation into a space charged with subtle energy. Every movement, Every glance seemed to carry more weight than before. Their proximity was no longer just about casual attention, it had shifted into something delicate, magnetic, and undeniably personal. The three women, still positioned around him, exuded a quiet confidence, and he felt himself pulled toward them without fully understanding why. The woman near the stairwell leaned slightly forward as she spoke, her voice lower, softer, almost conspiratorial. Her hand brushed lightly against the railing, close enough that his fingers occasionally lingered near hers. Each accidental touch sent a ripple of awareness through him, a warmth that spread slowly, insistently, from his chest to his fingertips. He found himself conscious of how close they were, yet the closeness felt natural, unforced, almost protective. The woman by the conference room mirrored his posture in subtle ways, leaning slightly as he did, tilting her head when he did, her presence a quiet echo of his own gestures. The synchronization wasn't deliberate, but it created a sense of intimacy that surprised him. He noticed how the soft curve of her shoulder, the gentle slope of her wrist, and the careful way she placed her hands on the table all seemed to draw him in, urging him to pay attention to more than just words. Even the third woman, lingering near the far doorway, contributed to the current of tension. Her eyes occasionally met his with a knowing glance, a faint but unmistakable smile playing on her lips. The subtle sway of her stance, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, and the almost imperceptible leaning toward him created an energy that was hard to ignore. Every small gesture, a hand brushing a notebook, a finger tracing the edge of a document, became magnified, carrying weight far beyond its ordinary purpose. He became acutely aware of his own reactions, the quickening of his heartbeat, the warmth spreading across his skin, the restless tension coiling in his stomach. Each touch, each glance, was a spark that made his awareness sharper, his senses heightened. He realized he was watching not just their actions, but the subtle language between them, the gentle interplay of presence, timing, and attention that spoke volumes without a single explicit word. A nervous laugh escaped him when one of the women playfully nudged a comment toward him, and she mirrored it instantly, her eyes crinkling with amusement. The connection was tangible, a delicate mix of admiration, intrigue, and the quiet thrill of closeness. It wasn't about desire in the overt sense, it was about the intoxicating awareness that they were attuned to each other's smallest signals, that each gesture mattered, and that he mattered in their attention. By the end of the hallway, the tension had deepened into something he could not ignore. Every glance, every shift, every brush of fabric against his skin had layered into a quiet, charged anticipation. He was caught in a delicate balance, aware of the age gap, conscious of professionalism, yet unable to resist the pull of this gentle, magnetic closeness. The hallway was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, and the knowledge that these subtle, deliberate interactions could evolve lingered in his mind like a quiet, thrilling promise. The tension that had been building throughout the hallway finally ripened into something tangible, subtle but undeniable. Their proximity was no longer just an awareness of each other, it had become a shared rhythm, a quiet dance of presence and attention. Each glance, each gesture, each shift of weight carried meaning, though unspoken, and he felt the full weight of it pressing gently against his chest. The woman near the stairwell smiled softly as she leaned a fraction closer, her hand resting on the railing near his own. The warmth radiating from her, combined with the faint brush of fabric against his sleeve, made his awareness sharpen. He noticed the small details he had missed before, the delicate tilt of her fingers, the subtle pulse of her wrist as she moved, the way her eyes lingered just long enough to create a connection. Every micro-interaction sent a quiet thrill through him, a feeling that was equal parts anticipation and comfort. The woman by the conference room closed the distance a little more naturally this time, resting her arm on the edge of the table where his hand had been. The brief contact of her skin against his, though fleeting, lingered in his mind as a warmth that seemed to seep inward, softening the tension coiled tightly in his chest. Her laughter, soft and genuine, echoed in the hallway, and he realized it wasn't just amusement he was hearing, it was intimacy, an acknowledgement of connection that transcended casual conversation. Even the woman near the far doorway contributed to the quiet, emotional crescendo. Her eyes met his in a shared understanding, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside the hallway seemed to disappear. The subtle shift of her stance, the slight lean forward, the gentle brush of her sleeve against the edge of his hand as she gestured, each action was deliberate in its gentleness, a careful exploration of closeness without overt declaration. It was electrifying in a way that felt safe, warm, and profoundly personal all at once. The narrator felt a swirl of emotions, nervousness, excitement, admiration, and a strange, grounding comfort. The touches were small but significant, a hand resting lightly on his forearm while emphasizing a point, a casual brush of fingers against his as papers were shifted, the near weightless warmth of their presence surrounding him. It was a tactile language, a way of speaking without words, and he found himself savoring every second, every fleeting moment of contact. In that charged, slow-moving moment, laughter and words blended seamlessly with glances and touches. He became acutely aware of the depth of the connection forming. It wasn't about romance in a dramatic sense, nor about desire in its simplest form. It was about being seen, being noticed, and being included in a quiet, shared understanding. Each woman, in her own way, was teaching him that intimacy could exist in softness, in subtlety, in the unspoken gestures that lingered longer than words ever could. By the time the brief encounter began to wind down, the emotional impact had settled firmly in his chest. There was warmth in his pulse, a thrill in the awareness of closeness, and a quiet sense of gratitude for the trust and attention they had offered. He understood, in that small but profoundly impactful moment, that these connections, gentle, unassuming, yet charged with intention, could shape the way he felt, the way he noticed others, and the way he experienced the world around him. The hallway, once just a passage, had become a stage for something quietly transformative, a memory that would linger long after they had parted. The hallway, which had felt charged with quiet tension and magnetic closeness, began to settle into a calm rhythm. The three women, having shared moments of subtle touch, meaningful glances, and soft laughter, gradually stepped back, though the warmth of their presence lingered like sunlight after a cloud passes. It was not an abrupt separation, but a gentle easing, as if the universe itself had given permission for the tension to soften without vanishing entirely. He noticed the small gestures that made the moment feel complete. One of the women, near the stairwell, offered a reassuring smile as she straightened her posture, her hand brushing lightly against the railing, a final, delicate echo of the touch they had shared. The warmth of that brief connection lingered in his awareness, a comforting pulse that reminded him that trust and attention could exist without fanfare. The woman by the conference room mirrored his movements subtly, her gaze following him as he shifted slightly, her expression a blend of amusement and quiet affection. There was no rush, no urgent demand for words or explanation, only the recognition that something meaningful had passed between them, a bond formed in a space where ordinary interactions had previously reigned. He found himself observing her gestures with newfound appreciation, the way her fingers had lingered near his arm earlier, the soft curve of her smile, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she laughed. Each memory was a thread weaving into a tapestry of connection that was both comforting and exhilarating. Even the woman near the far doorway maintained a presence that was subtle but significant. Her eyes met his one last time, and the unspoken understanding between them was clear. There was mutual respect, admiration, and an acknowledgement of shared intimacy, all wrapped in quiet professionalism. The slight nod she gave as she turned to leave felt like a promise, a recognition that this moment would not be forgotten, that the warmth of connection could persist even in the mundane flow of everyday life. As he walked down the hallway after they had moved on, the echoes of the encounter remained with him. The warmth of their presence, the subtle brushes of skin against skin, the gentle but deliberate attention, and the shared glances all left a lingering imprint. He felt a quiet gratitude for the experience, for the vulnerability that had been shared, and for the realization that intimacy did not always require overt declarations. Sometimes it existed in softness, in pauses, in the gentle acknowledgement of another person's presence. In the quiet aftermath, he reflected on the lessons of the afternoon. Connection, he realized, was not always loud or dramatic. It could exist in subtleties: the warmth of a hand near yours, the meaningful pause in conversation, the steadying comfort of someone's gaze. He felt changed, more attuned to others, more aware of the layers of human interaction, and more open to the slow, careful unfolding of relationships. The hall, now empty once more, seemed to hold a memory in its walls. Though the women had returned to their routines, the invisible threads of connection stretched quietly between them, leaving the narrator with a sense of anticipation for what might unfold naturally in the days to come. It was a gentle, satisfying conclusion, where respect, warmth, and subtle romantic tension coexisted, a story complete, yet leaving room for the heart to continue noticing, feeling, and connecting in quiet, meaningful ways.